Good evening. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the podcast where we slow down, settle in, and journey backwards through time to explore the quiet corners of human history. Tonight, we're going to embark on a gentle exploration of something so fundamental to human survival, yet so often overlooked in the grand narratives of empires and dynasties: the simple act of sleep. Imagine yourself in a place far removed from the comfortable bedroom where you lie now. Picture yourself in a time over 4,000 years in the past, in the vast Nile Valley of ancient Egypt. The sun has mercifully begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and deep orange. The heat of the day, which has been relentless and intense, begins to shift into something different. Still warm, yes, but now tinged with the possibility of relief. For millions of people living along the Nile during the height of ancient Egyptian civilization, sleep was not a luxury. It was not a comfort. It was not, as we might think of it today, a period of rest selected from a menu of leisure activities. Sleep was essential. It was survival. And yet the challenge of achieving restful sleep in a land where temperatures could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 49 degrees Celsius, was one that every single Egyptian, from the pharaoh in his palace to the laborer in the village, had to navigate night after night, season after season. This is the story we're going to tell tonight. Not a story of grand monuments or military conquests, but a story of the everyday ingenuity, the practical wisdom, and the patient adaptations of a civilization that learned, over millennia, how to make sleep possible in one of the most extreme climates on Earth. We'll explore how they built their homes, how they dressed or undressed for sleep, what they drank in the evenings, how they arranged their sleeping spaces, and what they believed about the nature of sleep itself. As we move through each layer of this history, you'll begin to understand that the Egyptians didn't simply endure the heat passively. They engaged with it. They questioned it. They engineered solutions to it. They negotiated with it, spiritually and practically, every single night. And in doing so, they left us with insights that remain relevant even now, in our climate-controlled world, because they teach us something fundamental about how the human body actually needs to sleep. So, settle in, make yourself comfortable. Let the ordinary challenges of ancient Egyptian sleep carry you backward in time, to a civilization that solved one of humanity's most pressing problems not through technology as we know it, but through observation, patience, and an intimate understanding of how heat, light, and the human body interact. This is Boring History for Sleep. Tonight we're sleeping like an ancient Egyptian. To truly understand how ancient Egyptians approached sleep, we must first understand the rhythm of their days. The human body does not exist in isolation from its environment. Rather, it is deeply woven into the fabric of climate, season, geography, and the cycles of work and rest that define a culture. And nowhere was this truer than in ancient Egypt. Let us begin then with the morning. Imagine yourself waking in a household of ancient Egypt, perhaps in Memphis, the sprawling capital city in Lower Egypt, or perhaps in Thebes, further south, where the heat grows even more intense. You wake not because of an alarm, but because of the light. The Egyptian sun, which rises with remarkable speed in this latitude, has already begun to flood the sky. It may be only 5 or 6 in the morning, and yet the darkness has already surrendered almost completely. The house you wake in is constructed in a very particular way, adapted over centuries to the demands of this climate. The walls are thick, made of mud brick that has been laboriously formed and set to dry in that same relentless sun. This mud brick, which might seem crude to us, is actually a brilliant adaptation. The thickness of these walls, often 2 to 3 feet deep, serves as a thermal buffer. During the day, as the sun beats down on the exterior, the heat penetrates slowly, gradually, through the mud brick. By late afternoon, when the outside air is at its hottest, the interior of the house may still be somewhat cool. But this benefit is temporary. As night falls, the relationship reverses. The exterior walls, having absorbed the day's heat, begin to cool relatively quickly in the desert night. But the interior, having been slowly heated all day, retains its warmth. This is the paradox of mud brick construction in an extreme climate. The same thermal mass that keeps the house bearable during the day makes it uncomfortably warm at night. And this is the first challenge that the Egyptian sleeper faced. The house has very few windows, and these windows are small and positioned carefully. They are not there primarily for light or ventilation, though those benefits exist. Rather, they are designed to be sealed. Heavy shutters, made of wood or woven materials, can be closed to block the entry of both light and heat during the day. Imagine the household routine. In the early morning, before the heat becomes overwhelming, these shutters are opened. Light floods in, air can move slightly. But as the day progresses, and the temperature outside begins to climb, reaching 100, then 110, then 120 degrees Fahrenheit, the shutters are gradually closed again. The house becomes darker, cooler, a refuge from the murderous heat outside. But here is the difficulty. This very same darkness and coolness make the house less appealing at night, when the stored heat in the walls begins to create an oppressive warmth. The Egyptians could not simply open the shutters again and let the cool night air in, because to do so in many cases would be to invite the infiltration of insects, dust, and potentially dangerous animals. Scorpions, snakes, and other creatures that sheltered during the day began to move about in the relative cool of evening. The shutters, therefore, often remained closed or only partially open. What of the sleeping areas themselves? The rhythm of daily work in ancient Egypt was by necessity adjusted to accommodate the heat. Imagine yourself as an ordinary working person in this civilization. You rise early, as we've described. The household might eat a simple breakfast, bread perhaps, and some beer. Yes, beer. The water in the Nile could be unsafe to drink without processing, and the practice of fermenting grain into beer served both nutritional and practical purposes. A light beer, more nutritious than water and made safer through the fermentation process, was consumed even by children. After this breakfast you begin your work. And here is a crucial rhythm, the work that requires the most physical exertion. Building, farming, heavy labor is pushed toward the cooler hours of the morning and the late afternoon and early evening. The midday hours, roughly from 10 in the morning until 3 or 4 in the afternoon, are the worst. The heat is not merely uncomfortable, it is dangerous. It can kill. So, the rhythm of Egyptian daily life was built around avoidance of this window. Some individuals, particularly those involved in agricultural labor, might take what we might call a siesta during these dangerous hours. They would retire to the shade of a structure, or to a shaded space by the riverbank, and rest. This was not laziness, this was sense. The human body, when exposed to 120-degree temperatures and physical exertion, is at risk of heat exhaustion and heat stroke. The Egyptians, though they did not have the scientific vocabulary to describe these conditions, understood them intimately. They understood that the body needed respite. Now, consider the household itself during these midday hours. The family, if they have shelter, may retreat to the interior of the house, if the house has a flat roof, and many Egyptian houses did. There might be a sheltered structure on top, perhaps a pergola or a covered pavilion where the intense sun is blocked but air can still circulate. But for many ordinary people, there is simply the main room of the house, shuttered and dim, and as cool as can be managed. For many Egyptians, particularly those of means, the layout of the house included a central courtyard. This courtyard, open to the sky during certain times of day, could be flooded with water from the Nile. Imagine the cool touch of this water, the slight evaporation that follows, how the temperature in the immediate vicinity of the courtyard would drop slightly. The courtyard would be shaded by porticos, covered walkways that circled it. During the hottest parts of the day, servants or family members might splash water on the courtyard's floor and walls, enhancing the cooling effect of evaporation. This was not a luxury. It was a practical adaptation that made the house more bearable. As the afternoon progresses and the external temperature begins its descent, there is a subtle shift. The worst is passing. The dangerous hours are receding. Evening approaches. And with it comes the second major challenge of the Egyptian climate. What do you do when the stored heat in the house walls begins to make the interior uncomfortably warm? Let us move forward in our imagined day to early evening. The sun, now lower on the horizon, casts long shadows. The temperature outside is still quite high, perhaps 90 degrees Fahrenheit, but it is dropping steadily. The house, however, is near its warmest. The walls, which have been absorbing the sun's heat all day, have reached their maximum temperature. The interior is now stifling. The servants begin to open shutters again, carefully, to allow the cooler air from outside to begin circulating. In wealthier households, slaves or servants might be positioned to fan the air, using large palm fronds or woven fans to keep it moving. The principle was simple. Stagnant air in a warm room feels hotter than moving air. Motion, any motion, helps. Dinner, the main meal of the day for many Egyptians, is often taken in the early evening, as soon as the outside temperature becomes tolerable. A worker might eat bread, perhaps some onions, possibly some fish or meat if available. Beer continues to be the primary beverage. The meal itself, eaten in the relative cool of early evening, is a time of social connection, but it is also, functionally, a way to take sustenance while the body can tolerate eating. Eating a large meal in the middle of a 120-degree day is deeply unpleasant and potentially dangerous. The body's digestive processes generate heat, and in extreme external heat, this becomes uncomfortable. As darkness falls, and here is another remarkable feature of the Egyptian climate, the darkness comes quickly. There is little twilight. The sun seems to plunge below the horizon, and darkness ensues. Stars emerge rapidly. The temperature begins to drop more significantly. This is the threshold moment, the time when the possibility of sleep, real sleep, begins to emerge. By 9 or 10 in the evening, perhaps earlier in the deepest part of summer, the temperature outside has dropped substantially. The air might be 80 degrees Fahrenheit, or even cooler, but the house, remember, is still warm. The heat it absorbed all day is still radiating from the walls. This is the fundamental conflict that the Egyptian sleeper faces every single night from May through September. The outside air is now cooler and more pleasant, but to open the house fully to this air is to invite the dangers of the night: insects, pests, potential intruders. The solution that developed in Egyptian households was a careful negotiation. Windows and doors might be left partially open, or shutters might be adjusted to allow some airflow while still providing protection. In wealthier households, there might be servants positioned to keep air moving, using fans. In poorer households, people might simply accept the heat and find other ways to cope with it. The sleeping spaces themselves were often on the roof. The roof of an Egyptian house was a functional space, not merely decorative or utilitarian. It was a place where people spent time during the day. It was often cooler near the edges due to slight air movement. And it was where many people slept, particularly during the summer months. A person might carry a mat or a simple bed up to the roof in the evening and lay it out there. The roof, being exposed to the night sky, benefited from radiative cooling. The heat that had accumulated in the flat surface would radiate away into the clear night sky, and the air above it would circulate more freely. If the roof was not an option, and for apartment-like structures in densely populated areas, it might not be, then people slept in inner rooms, in spaces that were as far as possible from the exterior walls that still held the day's heat. Some wealthier households might have had basement or semi-underground rooms, where the temperature remained more moderate due to the insulating properties of being partially surrounded by the earth itself. These rooms would be cooler year-round, and during the summer, they would be significantly more comfortable. Now, let us consider the body itself and what it wears to sleep. This is a detail that seems mundane but is actually critical to understanding how the Egyptians managed sleep in such heat. Sleeping garments, for most of the population, were minimal. A simple linen tunic, or even just a wrapped piece of linen cloth, might be all that covered the body. Linen was the fabric of choice in ancient Egypt. It came from flax plants that grew in the Nile Valley, and it was far more breathable and comfortable in heat than wool, which was rarely used except in the delta regions or for special purposes. But even this might be too much on the hottest nights. Many ordinary Egyptians simply slept naked or in underclothing so minimal as to be nearly non-existent. For wealthier individuals, particularly women of the elite classes, there was more elaborate sleepwear, but even this was constructed of linen and designed to be as open and breathable as possible. The question of sleep coverings, blankets, or sheets presents another interesting paradox. One might think that in such heat, no covering would be desired, but the human body, even in heat, benefits psychologically from some kind of covering. Additionally, even the thinnest linen sheet or cloth can provide protection from insects and can help distribute body heat more evenly, preventing some parts of the body from becoming too hot, while others remain warm. A single, very lightweight linen sheet, rather than no covering at all, was often the choice of the Egyptian sleeper. The sleeping surface itself varied dramatically by social class. A member of the elite might sleep on a bed, a wooden frame with a woven surface, or possibly with leather webbing that allowed for slight give and airflow beneath the body. These beds were often angled or designed so that the head was elevated. The elevation served a purpose. It aided in circulation and, in some cases, made breathing easier in the heat. A person lying flat on a hot night might feel more uncomfortable. A slight elevation of the head and torso could make a significant difference in comfort level. For ordinary people, the sleeping surface might be a simple mat made of woven reeds or rushes. These materials, being natural and having a loose weave, allowed for air circulation beneath the body. The mat might be placed on the ground or on a simple wooden frame. A cushion or pillow, often filled with reeds, straw, or soft plant materials, might support the head. The principle was always the same: maximize airflow, minimize direct contact with heat-absorbing surfaces. Let us now consider the broader landscape in which all of this daily rhythm occurs. The Nile Valley is not entirely desert. It is a ribbon of fertile land bordered by desert. But the heat of the river valley itself, during summer, is extreme. The river brings water, and water brings life, but it also brings humidity. The mornings and evenings near the river can be quite humid, which paradoxically makes the heat feel more oppressive. There is little to no breeze in many areas of the valley. The heat seems to settle and stagnate. Yet to the east and west of the valley, in the actual desert, the situation is different. The desert, while unbearably hot during the day, cools dramatically at night. The dry air, lacking moisture, radiates heat away to the clear sky with remarkable efficiency. By midnight, the temperature in the deep desert might drop to 70 degrees Fahrenheit or even cooler. But for most Egyptians, living in the cultivated valley, where the Nile provided water and fertile soil, this extreme diurnal temperature swing was not available. They endured the heat of the day and the lingering warmth of the night. The seasons themselves played a crucial role in determining sleep patterns and sleeping arrangements. The Egyptian calendar had 3 seasons, each tied to the rhythm of the Nile itself. Akhet was the inundation season, roughly June to September, when the annual flood brought water and rich silt to the fields. This was also the hottest season, when the heat was most relentless. Peret was the growing season, October to February, when the temperature was moderate and the weather was relatively pleasant. Shemu was the harvest season, March to May, when the heat began to increase but had not yet reached its peak. For the sleeper, this meant that the challenge of sleeping in extreme heat was not year-round. It was concentrated into perhaps 4 or 5 months, roughly June through September, and sometimes extending into early October. During these months, every aspect of life was adjusted. The amount of rest taken during the day might increase. The timing of meals shifted later in the day. The sleeping spaces and methods were adapted. Once the cooler seasons arrived, in October, the challenge eased significantly. But during those long, hot months, sleep itself became a matter of strategy. How many hours could a person realistically sleep through in such heat? If the house was still too warm in the early part of the night, a person might lie awake for an hour or two, waiting for sufficient cooling. Once the temperature dropped, they might sleep soundly. But in the hours before dawn, as the coolest time of night approached, they might sleep most deeply. This meant that the Egyptian sleep pattern was not necessarily consolidated into one long block of 8 continuous hours. It was segmented, interrupted, and adapted to the temperature rhythm. Some scholars have theorized that the biphasic sleep pattern, sleeping in 2 distinct blocks rather than one, was common not just in medieval Europe, but also in the ancient world, and particularly in hot climates where the middle of the night was significantly cooler than the evening. If this were the case, an Egyptian sleeper might sleep from perhaps 10 o'clock to midnight, wake and rest awake for an hour or two, then sleep again from 2 until 6 in the morning, when the heat began to build and the approach of dawn made sleep less comfortable. This pattern would mean that the sleeper was not frustrated by wakefulness in the middle of the night. Rather, this wakefulness was expected and accepted as part of the natural rhythm. The architecture, the clothing, the food and drink, the timing of activity, all of these were integrated into a coherent system that helped people survive and function in one of the world's most challenging climates. But this was not simply a matter of passive endurance. It was active, thoughtful adaptation. And as we move deeper into our exploration of ancient Egyptian sleep, we'll see that this adaptation extended to the spiritual and psychological realms as well. The rhythm of heat and survival in ancient Egypt was relentless, but it was also something that each person who lived there came to know intimately. The body, over generations, adapted. The mind learned to work with the climate rather than against it, and the culture developed practices and beliefs that supported this negotiation with the heat, the sun, and the necessity of sleep in one of the world's most extreme environments. This is the foundation upon which all else rests. Before we can understand the specific practices, the technologies, the spiritual beliefs about sleep that flourished in ancient Egypt, we must understand this basic rhythm. The day, with its terrible heat, the evening, with its slow cooling, the night, with its relative comfort and its hidden dangers, the necessity of sleep, and the constant challenge of achieving it. This is the heartbeat of ancient Egyptian daily life, and it shaped everything, from the architecture of homes, to the timing of meals, to the very structure of how people worked, rested, and ultimately slept. Now that we have established the daily rhythm and environmental challenges that shaped how ancient Egyptians approached sleep, we must ask a deeper historical question. How did these practices develop? How did a civilization learn, over millennia, to negotiate with such extreme heat? And what specific innovations, developed by specific people and refined over generations, made sleep possible in conditions that might otherwise have been unbearable? The answer to this question takes us backward through time, not just years or decades, but centuries. The ancient Egyptian civilization as we think of it, with its grand pyramids, its hierarchical society, its sophisticated understanding of medicine and architecture, did not emerge fully formed. It evolved, it adapted, and each adaptation represented a solution, discovered by someone, tested by everyone, refined, and passed down. Let us begin in the very earliest period of Egyptian history, in the centuries before the construction of the Great Pyramids, before Egypt was even truly unified. We must imagine the Nile Valley in the Predynastic period, roughly 6000 to 3000 BCE. The climate then was not fundamentally different from what it would become. The Nile still flooded annually, the heat was still intense, but the human settlements were smaller, more scattered, more primitive in their construction. The earliest Egyptians, those who first settled permanently in the Nile Valley, likely lived in simple structures. Archaeological evidence suggests that early dwellings were often small, with limited interior space. They might have been constructed of reeds and mud, or simple mud brick. The question of sleep in such primitive structures, in such heat, must have been challenging indeed. And yet, this is precisely where the story of innovation begins. Consider a hypothetical early Egyptian family. We cannot name them, for history has not preserved such details, trying to solve the problem of sleep in a small, hot dwelling. The solution was not to build bigger houses, for that would have required more labor and resources. Rather, it was to observe closely what worked and what did not. If sleeping outside on a hot night was more comfortable than sleeping inside, then people slept outside. If certain materials were more comfortable to sleep on than others, those materials were sought. If certain times of day or night were cooler, those times were preferred for sleep. These early experiments were not written down, they were not systematized. They were simply the daily problem-solving of people trying to survive and rest in a challenging environment. But over generations, these simple observations hardened into practices, and practices, when they work, become traditions. The tradition of sleeping on the roof during summer months, for instance, is not something that appears suddenly in the archaeological record. Rather, it emerges, gradually, becoming more refined and more deliberate over time. By the Old Kingdom period, the era of the pyramid builders, roughly 2686 to 2181 BCE, roof sleeping was an established practice, at least among those who had substantial houses with strong roofs. Consider the practical wisdom that would need to be passed down to make roof sleeping work. A roof must be strong enough to support human weight. It must be flat, or nearly so, to provide a safe sleeping surface. It must be accessible, with a way to climb up and down safely, especially in darkness. It must be positioned where it can catch the cooling night breeze, but not be exposed to dangerous animals or intruders. It should be arranged so that the sleeper's possessions remain secure. This is not simple. This is knowledge that accumulated over time, learned from experience, taught from parent to child, refined with each generation. The construction of the pyramids themselves, those enormous monuments to the power of the pharaohs, tells us something important about the evolution of Egyptian engineering and knowledge. The pyramids were built largely during the season of inundation from June to September, the hottest months. Tens of thousands of workers labored under the sun to move, place, and align enormous stone blocks. How did these workers manage? How did they sleep, recover, and maintain the physical capacity to continue this grueling work night after night? The answer involves the master builders and architects who organized these projects. These were not anonymous figures. Many of them are known to us by name, preserved in records and inscriptions. Imhotep, the architect of the step pyramid of Djoser, is one of the earliest knowns by name. He lived approximately 2670 BCE, and he was not merely a builder but a designer, an innovator who solved problems. While our historical records do not give us the specific details of how Imhotep managed the sleep schedules and comfort of his workers, we can infer from the scale and success of his projects that he understood logistics, organization, and the physical demands of labor in extreme heat. Imhotep was so revered for his innovations and wisdom that he was eventually deified, made into a god, by later generations. This is extraordinary. An architect, remembered for so long and with such reverence that he achieved divine status. This speaks to the profound respect that the Egyptians held for those who solved practical problems, who built structures that endured, who organized human efforts successfully. And implicit in Imhotep's success was an understanding of how to keep workers healthy, rested, and functional despite the heat and the grueling labor. These master builders would have coordinated the work schedules to accommodate the heat. They would have ensured that workers had adequate rest, adequate hydration, and adequate shelter from the worst of the sun. They would have developed systems for rotation, for timing, for the management of human effort in an extreme environment. They would have understood that a worker who had not slept adequately was a worker who would make mistakes, move slowly, or collapse from heat exhaustion, and they would have organized the work accordingly. Archaeological evidence from workers' settlements associated with pyramid construction reveals much about how these logistical challenges were managed. The workers were housed in villages, not left to fend for themselves. They were fed regularly. They were given rest periods. They were provided with shelter. All of this required planning and organization. Someone had to decide where the shelters would be built, how they would be arranged, and how the schedules of labor and rest would be coordinated. This was the work of the master builders and overseers. As we move forward in Egyptian history into the Middle Kingdom period, roughly 2055 to 1650 BCE, we see the development of more sophisticated architectural knowledge and refinement. The homes of the wealthy became larger, more complex, with multiple rooms and courtyards. And with these structural improvements came refinements in the management of heat and sleep. The simple observation that a roof was cooler than an interior room evolved into a deliberate architectural principle. Living spaces should be designed with multiple options for sleeping, depending on the season and the temperature. One specific innovation that emerged during this period was the development of more sophisticated cooling systems, the basic principle of evaporative cooling, the process by which water, when it evaporates, draws heat from its surroundings, was not new. Water has been cooling people for as long as humans have had access to it. But the deliberate, systematic application of this principle to keep sleeping spaces comfortable was refined. Servants in wealthy households would water the courtyards and the roofs of sleeping areas. The water, evaporating in the dry Egyptian air, would cool the surrounding environment. This was not accidental, it was engineered. Someone observed the principle, understood it, understood why it worked, even without knowing the scientific vocabulary of thermodynamics, and applied it deliberately. The physics of evaporative cooling is this: when water evaporates, it requires energy. That energy is drawn from the surrounding air and surfaces, cooling them in the process. In a dry climate like Egypt's, evaporation is efficient. The relative humidity is so low that water evaporates readily, and the cooling effect is pronounced. A person who learns, through experience, that splashing water on a courtyard makes the surrounding area noticeably cooler, has learned a principle that works. They may not understand the mechanism, but they understand the result. We see evidence of this in the designs of houses discovered at archaeological sites like Kahun, a workers' town built during the reign of Amenemhat III in the Middle Kingdom, roughly 1860 BCE. The town was built to house workers involved in construction and administrative projects, and its layout reveals careful planning with regard to ventilation, shading, and cooling. The houses were arranged in a way that allowed for prevailing breezes to flow through them. Windows and openings were positioned to take advantage of natural air currents. The central courtyards were designed to be spaces where water could be used to cool the surrounding area. This was not haphazard construction. This was designed, thought out, planned by someone who understood the principles of heat and airflow, even if they did not express those principles in scientific language. The houses at Kahun provide us with a remarkable window into how the Egyptians thought about residential design during the Middle Kingdom. The poor workers' houses were small, perhaps 200 square feet, but they were arranged with an understanding of how heat moved through them. The wealthier houses were larger, with courtyards and multiple rooms, and all of them revealed an understanding that sleep required comfort, and comfort required thoughtful design. As we move through the Second Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation and transition, and into the New Kingdom period, roughly 1550 to 1077 BCE, we see a resurgence of building activity and a refinement of architectural knowledge. This is perhaps the most famous period of ancient Egyptian history. It was the age of great pharaohs like Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, and Ramesses II. And it was an era of increased sophistication in all aspects of life, including the management of sleep and comfort. The palaces and temples built during this period reveal an advanced understanding of architecture and climate management. The Temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak, begun during the early New Kingdom and expanded over centuries by successive pharaohs, is a sprawling complex of courts and halls covering an enormous area. While temples were not residential spaces, they did house priests and other personnel, and the architectural principles applied to them inform us about how the Egyptians approached the problem of creating comfortable spaces in extreme heat. The temples have thick walls, limited windows, strategic openings for airflow, and in some cases, basins for water that could be used to cool the surrounding area. The design of Karnak reveals an understanding of how people move through spaces and how those spaces feel. The outer courts are open and exposed. As one moves inward, the spaces become more enclosed, more shaded. The hypostyle halls, those magnificent spaces with towering columns, create areas of filtered light and shade, and the height of the columns allows warm air to rise and escape, creating a slight cooling effect through convection. Whether these effects were deliberately engineered or simply happy accidents of following religious and ceremonial requirements is unclear. But the result was that the innermost sanctum of the temple, where the most sacred rituals took place, was noticeably cooler than the exterior. One pharaoh in particular stands out as someone who was deeply concerned with the practical aspects of governance and the well-being of his people, Thutmose III, who reigned from approximately 1479 to 1425 BCE. Thutmose III was a military strategist, and a brilliant administrator, but he was also deeply interested in construction and architectural innovation. He inherited the throne as a child, but eventually became the most powerful pharaoh of his era. During his long reign, many of the most important temples and palaces were built or expanded. The Temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak was significantly enlarged under his rule. While we do not have specific historical records about Thutmose III's personal sleep arrangements, we know from his records that he was concerned with the organization of labor, the provisioning of workers, and the logistics of major construction projects. Thutmose III's reign was characterized by military campaigns, an expansion of Egyptian power, but also by an investment in infrastructure and building. He understood that the maintenance of his power and the stability of his kingdom depended on being able to house his government, his military, and his workers in functioning facilities. This meant attention to practical details like where people would sleep and how comfortable their sleeping arrangements would be. A ruler who could provide his army with adequate rest and his workers with decent shelter would maintain their loyalty and their productivity. This concern with the practical aspects of managing human beings in an extreme climate extended to the medical understanding of heat-related illness. The ancient Egyptians, despite lacking modern medical knowledge, understood that exposure to extreme heat could kill. They had treatments for what we would now call heat exhaustion and heat stroke, if not by those names. Medical texts that survive from the New Kingdom period describe conditions that we would easily recognize as heat-related illnesses, and they describe interventions, rest in cool spaces, consumption of cooling beverages, immersion in water. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, a medical text dating to approximately 1600 BCE, is one of the oldest written medical documents in existence. It contains descriptions of illnesses and treatments, organized by the type of injury or illness. While it does not specifically focus on sleep, it reveals an understanding of how heat affects the body and how to treat heat-related problems. The text describes something similar to heat stroke, a condition in which the body becomes dangerously hot, the person becomes confused or loses consciousness, and death may result. The recommended treatment involves moving the person to a cool place, cooling them with water, and allowing them to rest. This same practical, observational approach that informed medical treatment would have informed the approach to sleep and rest. The Egyptians understood through observation and experience that the body needed cool conditions, rest, and recovery from heat exposure in order to function properly. Now let us consider a specific historical figure who, while not directly about sleep, illustrates the broader pattern of Egyptian innovation and problem-solving. Amenhotep III, who reigned from approximately 1390 to 1352 BCE. Amenhotep III was a great builder and patron of the arts. He expanded Egypt's power and wealth considerably. During his reign, a new temple at Luxor was constructed, one of the most beautiful and remarkable structures in all of ancient Egypt. The design of Luxor Temple reveals sophisticated understanding of light, shadow, proportion, and the passage of people through spaces. The temple was dedicated to the god Amun, and served both religious and state functions. Walking through Luxor Temple is an experience that ancient Egyptians would have been familiar with, and modern visitors can still sense it. The temple opens to a broad sunlit pylon, the gateway. This pylon, marked by massive stone blocks and statues, is exposed and bright. Moving inward, one enters the courtyard, which is also open to the sky and bright. But the columns surrounding the courtyard provide some shade, and as one moves deeper into the temple, the spaces become progressively more enclosed, cooler, and more mysterious. The sanctum of the temple, the innermost chamber where the statue of the god was housed, was designed to be cool and protected from direct sunlight. The passage through the temple moved from bright, open courtyards to progressively narrower, more enclosed spaces, each filled with columns, eventually reaching the sanctum. The walls of the inner rooms were thick. The openings for light were small and positioned to avoid direct solar heat. The effect was that the innermost chamber was noticeably cooler than the exterior, even on the hottest days. This design served religious purposes. It created a sense of mystery and sanctity, a sense of moving from the profane outer world into the sacred inner realm. But it also served the practical purpose of keeping the innermost, most sacred space cool. The priests who tended the temple would have spent time in this innermost sanctum, and they would have found it relatively cool and comfortable compared to the exterior heat. A priest who had to stand and perform rituals for hours would have found the cool temperature of the sanctum far more tolerable than standing in the open courtyard in the blazing sun. This is an important insight. The religious and the practical in ancient Egypt were not separate. The design of sacred spaces was influenced by practical concerns about heat and comfort, even though the explicit reason for the design was religious. Similarly, the rituals and practices related to sleep and night, which had religious significance and meaning, were also deeply practical. A ritual that required certain practices related to sleep was also a ritual that, through those practices, supported good sleep. The priesthood itself, as a class of people, developed routines and practices related to sleep and rest that reflected their understanding of the body's needs. Priests had to be ritually pure to perform their duties. Purity involved washing, the removal of impurities, and ritual practices. But it also involved rest. A priest who was exhausted, who had not slept adequately, was considered unfit for duties. The very act of performing sacred rituals required a clear mind and a rested body. The maintenance of ritual purity thus included the maintenance of adequate sleep and rest. The priesthood's schedule included periods of sleep and rest, not as breaks from sacred duty, but as part of sacred duty, as necessary to the maintenance of purity. Let us move forward now to perhaps the most famous figure of ancient Egyptian history, Ramesses II, often called Ramesses the Great, who reigned from approximately 1279 to 1213 BCE. Ramesses II was a prolific builder and a military commander. He ruled for 66 years, one of the longest reigns in Egyptian history, and fathered over 100 children. He built or expanded more temples than any other pharaoh. He fought major battles and negotiated treaties, and he lived to the age of 90, an extraordinary lifespan for the ancient world, when the average life expectancy was perhaps 30 or 40 years. Ramesses II's longevity and continued vitality, despite his advanced age, is worth considering in the context of sleep and rest. The pharaoh, as a divine being in Egyptian religious belief, was supposed to maintain his health and vigor. The identity of the pharaoh with the god Horus meant that the pharaoh's health was seen as essential to the health and prosperity of the entire kingdom. Court records and artistic depictions suggest that Ramesses II was indeed vigorous and active well into old age. While we cannot attribute his longevity solely to good sleep, we can note that Ramesses II had access to the finest that Egyptian civilization could provide in terms of comfort, rest, and health care. His sleeping chambers in the palace at Pi-Ramesses were presumably among the most sophisticated and carefully designed spaces for sleep in all of Egypt. Pi-Ramesses was a new city, built by Ramesses II in the Nile Delta as an administrative and military center. It was constructed specifically according to his vision, and it embodied the accumulated knowledge of Egyptian architecture and design developed over more than 1,000 years. The palace at Pi-Ramesses, built by Ramesses II in the Delta region, has been excavated archaeologically in the modern era. While the remains are fragmentary, much has been destroyed by time and the rising water table, they reveal a palace of great complexity and sophistication. The palace was enormous, covering a large area and containing numerous chambers. The royal chambers, where the pharaoh and his family slept, would have been the most carefully designed spaces in the entire structure. We can imagine these royal sleeping chambers based on what we know about Egyptian architecture and royal life. They would have had thick walls to insulate against the heat. They would have had high ceilings to allow hot air to rise and escape. They would have had multiple openings that could be controlled, windows and doors that could be opened to allow the cool night air in, and closed during the day to keep the heat out. There would have been courtyards with water features that provided both practical cooling and aesthetic beauty. The royal chambers would have had servants or slaves whose job was to maintain comfort. In the evening, these servants would have opened shutters and doors at precisely the right time, when the outside air had cooled sufficiently, but before the dangerous night animals became too active. They would have used large fans to keep air moving. They would have sprinkled water on courtyards to enhance cooling through evaporation. They would have prepared the sleeping chambers, adjusting blankets and cushions, and in the morning, they would have secured the chambers again against the building heat. But even beyond the physical structures and the service of attendants, there was something else that contributed to Ramesses II's ability to maintain health and vigor into advanced age, the knowledge that he had inherited from his predecessors, knowledge that had been accumulated and refined over thousands of years. His physicians understood the importance of sleep. His advisors and household managers understood the importance of rest. His entire life was organized around the principle that to maintain the vigor of the divine pharaoh, adequate sleep and rest were essential. This is a crucial insight about the Egyptian approach to sleep. It was not viewed merely as a practical necessity, something to be managed when it interfered with the business of living. Rather, it was viewed as a fundamental requirement of health, of divine vigor, of the proper functioning of both the individual body and the body politic. A pharaoh who was rested and slept well was a pharaoh who could rule effectively. A worker who was rested could labor effectively. A priest who was rested could perform rituals effectively. Sleep was woven into the fabric of how the Egyptians understood health, duty, and the proper order of things. The integration of this understanding into the life of Egyptian society meant that the pursuit of good sleep, the creation of conditions that made sleep possible, was not a private concern but a public social concern. The ruler had a responsibility to ensure that his people had the conditions necessary for sleep. The master builder had a responsibility to design structures that accommodated sleep. The physician had a responsibility to understand and treat disorders of sleep and rest. And the individual had a responsibility to take advantage of the opportunities for sleep that were provided. This cultural understanding of sleep's importance created a coherent system. The architecture, the daily schedules, the seasonal adjustments, the medical knowledge, the spiritual and religious practices, all of these worked together to support good sleep. And because the system was coordinated, it was effective. A person living in ancient Egypt, whether pharaoh or laborer, was operating within a system that was explicitly designed to make sleep possible in one of the world's most challenging climates. As we think about the specific innovations and practices that will be explored in the segments to come, the design of beds, the use of specific foods and drinks, the spiritual practices associated with sleep, it is important to remember that all of these emerged from this historical development. They are not arbitrary. They are not mere folklore. They are the product of centuries of observation, experimentation, and refinement by a civilization that understood, deeply and intimately, the challenges of sleeping in extreme heat, and that developed practical, effective solutions to those challenges. The story of sleep in ancient Egypt is thus also a story of the evolution of a civilization, how a people learned to live in a difficult environment, how they solved problems through careful observation and thoughtful design, and how they integrated those solutions into every aspect of their lives, from the smallest household to the grandest palace, from the daily rhythms of work and rest to the spiritual and religious practices that gave meaning to their lives. As we have moved through the history of ancient Egypt and the development of practical innovations to manage sleep in extreme heat, we must now turn to a different kind of knowledge, not the practical knowledge of architecture and engineering, but the spiritual and cultural knowledge that surrounded sleep. For the ancient Egyptians, sleep was not merely a physical phenomenon. It was a threshold, a liminal space where the visible and invisible worlds met, where the boundaries between waking consciousness and other realms of being became permeable. To understand this fully, we must begin with what the archaeological record reveals to us about how the Egyptians imagined sleep and the night. The tombs of ancient Egypt are our most direct windows into their spiritual beliefs, because the Egyptians believed that the afterlife was essentially an eternal continuation of the earthly life. The objects they placed in tombs, the scenes they painted on tomb walls, the texts they inscribed, All of these tell us what they valued, what they feared, what they believed about the nature of existence and death. And what we find in the tombs is instructive. Beds appear frequently in tomb paintings and in tomb furnishings. The ancient Egyptians did not simply paint or carve images of everyday objects randomly. Every object had meaning. If beds appear with such regularity in tomb decoration, it is because sleep and rest held importance not just in daily life, but in the spiritual imagination. Sleep was a state that mattered. It was something worth commemorating, worth ensuring continued in the afterlife. The bed itself, as an object, reveals much about Egyptian values and understanding. Wealthy Egyptians slept on beds that were elevated above the ground, supported by legs. These beds were not merely functional, they were decorated, sometimes elaborately so. The legs might be carved to resemble animal legs. Lion legs were popular, perhaps reflecting the idea that the sleeper was in some way protected by the strength and power of the lion. The wooden frames were sometimes inlaid with ivory or semi-precious stones. The surfaces where the sleeper lay might be woven cords or leather straps that provided a slight springiness. But why this care and decoration? Why would the Egyptians invest such effort and resources into objects that served primarily a functional purpose? The answer lies in the spiritual understanding of sleep. To sleep in Egypt was to enter a state that had mystical significance. The sleeping person was crossing a threshold, entering a realm where the rules of waking reality did not entirely apply. The bed was thus not merely a place to lie down, it was a threshold object, a place of transition. One of the most fascinating aspects of Egyptian spiritual belief related to sleep was their concept of dreams. The Egyptians took dreams seriously. They believed that in dreams, the dreamer could encounter gods, receive messages, and glimpse truths that were hidden in waking life. This belief had practical consequences. Dream interpretation was a recognized skill. Certain dreams were seen as portentous. A person who had a dream of particular significance might consult a dream interpreter, someone trained in understanding the messages that gods communicated through dreams. Several papyri survive that contain dream interpretation texts. These texts describe various dreams and their interpretations. For example, dreaming of bread might indicate abundance, while dreaming of water might indicate purification or danger, depending on the context. These interpretations reveal an understanding that dreams were not random neural events, but meaningful communications. The dream was a language through which the divine could speak to the human. This understanding had implications for how the Egyptians approached sleep. If sleep was a time when divine communication could occur, then the conditions of sleep mattered. One needed to be in a proper spiritual state to receive such communications. One needed to sleep in a clean place. One might perform certain rituals before sleep to prepare the mind and spirit. One might make offerings or prayers before lying down. In this sense, sleep became a spiritual practice, not merely a physical necessity. The archaeological evidence for these beliefs is scattered, but suggestive. Amulets have been found in tombs, small objects made of stone or faience, inscribed with protective spells or divine names. Some of these appear to have been placed at the head of the bed or worn during sleep. The purpose was to protect the sleeper from harm, both physical harm and spiritual harm. Sleep in this understanding was a vulnerable state. The sleeper was exposed. Various supernatural forces might seek to harm them. Protection was necessary. There are also references in various texts to the dangers of sleep. One must be protected from demons or spirits that were active during the night. One must be protected from the evil eye, from witchcraft, from the malevolent intentions of enemies. The night was understood as a time when the boundaries between the visible and invisible worlds were particularly thin, and when malevolent forces were particularly active. This understanding of the dangers of sleep is reflected in architecture as well. The positioning of doorways, the arrangement of rooms. These were not merely about convenience or ventilation. They were also about protection. A sleeping chamber positioned in such a way that it had only one entrance, or positioned deep within the house, away from the exterior walls, was safer from supernatural intrusion. The threshold of a room, the boundary between one space and another, was considered a potentially dangerous place. One did not simply walk through it. One might perform a gesture of protection or speak a protective phrase. Now, let us consider what the archaeological discoveries at the Valley of the Kings reveal about elite sleep practices. The Valley of the Kings contains the tombs of the pharaohs of the New Kingdom. These tombs are among the most elaborate and carefully decorated tombs in all of archaeology. They descend deep into the rock, passing through multiple chambers, each decorated with religious texts and images. The innermost chamber contains the sarcophagus, the stone coffin in which the pharaoh's body would rest for eternity. But beyond the sarcophagus, the tomb contains much else. There are images of the pharaoh engaged in various activities. There are images of the pharaoh hunting, feasting, and, importantly, sleeping. These sleep scenes are depicted with careful attention to detail. The pharaoh is shown lying on a bed, often with attendants nearby. The bed itself is depicted with attention to its structure and decoration. The meaning is clear. The sleep of the pharaoh was important enough to commemorate eternally in the tomb. Some of the most intriguing archaeological evidence about Egyptian sleep practices comes from Amarna, the ancient city built by the pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BCE. Akhenaten was one of the most unusual pharaohs of ancient Egypt. He broke with many traditional practices, attempted religious reform, and built a new capital city. The city of Amarna was abandoned after his death, and it has been excavated in modern times to reveal a detailed picture of New Kingdom life. In the houses at Amarna, archaeologists have identified spaces that appear to have been dedicated sleeping chambers. These rooms are often on the upper floor of the house, away from the main living spaces. They are smaller than the main rooms, more private, more intimate. Some of these rooms have small windows positioned high in the walls, allowing for some ventilation while maintaining privacy and some protection from heat. The arrangement suggests a deliberate separation of sleeping spaces from other living spaces, a recognition that sleep required a different kind of environment than daily activities. One particularly intriguing discovery at Amarna is the presence of what appear to be sleeping platforms or benches along the walls of certain rooms. These would not have been beds in the modern sense, but rather prepared surfaces where one could lie down. The presence of these platforms in multiple rooms suggests that sleeping spaces might have been flexible. A person could sleep in various locations, depending on the season, the temperature, or the time of night. The concept of the night itself in Egyptian spiritual belief was complex and multivalent. The night was dangerous, yes, but it was also necessary. The sun god Ra was believed to travel through the underworld during the night, and this journey was seen as essential to the renewal of the cosmos. In a sense, the night was a mirror of the underworld, a realm of darkness and mystery, but also of transformation and renewal. To sleep was to participate, in a small way, in this cosmic process. The sleeper, like the sun god, descended into darkness and mystery, only to emerge again in the light. This cosmological understanding had practical implications. It meant that the night, and the sleep that occurred during the night, was not viewed as dead time, as time wasted, but as time invested in necessary cosmic processes. A person who slept well was not being lazy. They were participating in the fundamental rhythms of the cosmos. This philosophical understanding would have made it easier to accept the necessities of daytime rest during the hottest seasons. The rest was not a luxury, but a participation in the cosmic order. The architectural remains of temples provide us with additional clues about how the Egyptians understood sleep and the night. Many temples had a structure called a sacred lake, a body of water within the temple precincts. These lakes served religious purposes, but they also served practical purposes. They were sources of water for cooling and for ritual purification. During the night, when the air above the water was cooler due to the water's thermal properties, the area around the sacred lake would have been a relatively comfortable place to rest. Priests might have used these areas for meditation or sleep during certain times of the day or year. Some temples also had rooms called sleeping chambers of the god or similar names. These were thought to be places where the god could rest during the... Of course, gods do not sleep in the way humans do, so the purpose of these rooms was more symbolic than literal, but the symbolism is revealing. Even gods, in the Egyptian imagination, rested. Rest and sleep were not states imposed only on humans by the limitations of their flesh. They were states that were part of the natural order, affecting gods and humans alike. There is also intriguing archaeological evidence suggesting that certain rituals were performed at night or related to sleep. Nocturnal rituals, ceremonies performed in darkness or in the late evening, appear to have been part of religious practice in certain temples. These rituals would have involved priests or priestesses, and they would have required careful preparation and coordination. The fact that such rituals existed and were important enough to be documented suggests that the Egyptians had developed sophisticated understandings of how to move and work during darkness, how to maintain concentration and spiritual focus in nocturnal conditions, and how to manage the physical demands of ritual activity at night. The discovery of certain texts relating to sleep and dreams has also provided insight. The Chester Beatty Papyrus, named after the collector who owned it, contains a narrative that includes references to dreams and nocturnal visions. The text describes how a character experiences a dream that transforms their understanding and leads to important actions. The narrative treats the dream as a real and significant event, not as a delusion or fantasy. This literary treatment of dreams as meaningful and consequential suggests that in Egyptian culture, dreams were taken seriously, discussed, analyzed, and acted upon. Archaeological and textual evidence also reveals that certain substances were used to promote or affect sleep. References to specific herbs and plant materials appear in medical texts and in descriptions of daily life. Some of these are associated with relaxation and rest. Others appear to have been used for their mild sedative or calming properties. While the specific botanical identities of some of these substances remain uncertain, the pattern is clear. The Egyptians understood that certain plant materials could influence the condition of sleep, and they used this knowledge deliberately. The use of fragrant oils and incense is another area where practical and spiritual purposes overlapped. Certain oils were used to anoint the body before sleep. These oils had pleasant scents, certainly, but they also served other purposes. Some had mild medicinal properties. Some were believed to have protective or spiritually purifying properties. The practice of anointing the body before sleep was thus both a practical act of self-care and a spiritual preparation for the vulnerable state of sleep. One particularly fascinating aspect of Egyptian spiritual practice relates to the concept of Ka and Ba, two aspects of what we might translate as the soul or the personality. The Ka was understood as a kind of double or life force that existed alongside the physical body. The Ba was more like what we might call personality or consciousness, the unique essence of a person. During waking life, the Ka and Ba were firmly integrated with the physical body, but during sleep, particularly in certain types of dreams, it was believed that the Ba could separate from the body and travel to other realms. This was not understood as dangerous. It was a natural and normal process, but it required protection and proper circumstances. This belief had implications for how the sleeping environment was understood. The sleeping chamber was not merely a room where the body lay. It was a space where the spiritual aspects of the person could be safely separated from the body and could travel. The protection of the sleeping chamber from intrusion, both physical intrusion by animals or thieves and spiritual intrusion by malevolent forces, was thus essential. The symbolism of sleep appears in various religious texts as well. In the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and texts meant to guide the deceased in the afterlife. There are references to sleep and dreaming. The deceased person, in the afterlife, was sometimes depicted as sleeping, waiting for the opportunity to be reborn or to join the gods. Sleep in this context represents a state of expectation, of waiting for transformation. It is not merely rest, it is a prerequisite for renewal. As we consider all of this archaeological and textual evidence, a picture emerges of a civilization that understood sleep not as a simple biological necessity, but as a complex phenomenon that had practical, spiritual, and cosmic significance. The conditions of sleep mattered because sleep itself mattered. The protection of the sleeper mattered. The quality of the sleep mattered. The dreams that occurred during sleep mattered. This understanding was reflected in the culture's approach to sleeping spaces, sleeping practices, and the rituals and preparations associated with sleep. All of these were informed by the spiritual beliefs and cultural values that the Egyptians held, and because these beliefs and values were integrated into every level of society, from the pharaoh in his palace to the laborer in a modest house, they created a coherent cultural system in which sleep was honored and supported, not merely tolerated. The mystery of sleep, in the Egyptian imagination, was not something to be solved or conquered. Rather, it was something to be respected, negotiated with, and integrated into the larger understanding of how the world worked and how human beings fit into the cosmos. The Egyptians did not try to eliminate sleep, or to spend as little time sleeping as possible. Rather, they sought to make sleep as good as it could be, to create conditions in which sleep could be deep and restorative, to understand the messages that sleep and dreams brought, and to integrate sleep into their spiritual and practical lives. Now that we have explored the fundamental rhythms of Egyptian life, the historical development of sleep practices, and the spiritual beliefs that surrounded sleep, we must turn our attention to a question that has been hovering beneath the surface of our exploration. How different was the experience of sleep for different people in Egyptian society? For while the basic physical realities of heat and the necessity of sleep applied to all Egyptians equally, the actual lived experience of sleep varied dramatically, depending on where one stood in the social hierarchy. Ancient Egyptian society was highly stratified. At the apex was the pharaoh, understood to be a living god, separated from ordinary humanity by an unbridgeable gulf. Below the pharaoh were the elite, the nobility, the high priests, the wealthy landowners, the highest administrators of state. Below them were the middle classes, scribes, skilled craftspeople, minor officials, merchants of some means. And at the bottom were the masses, agricultural laborers, unskilled workers, servants, and slaves. This hierarchy was not merely a matter of wealth or power, though it certainly involved both of those things. It was encoded in law, in custom, in religious belief, and in the very structure of Egyptian society. A person's social position determined almost every aspect of their life: where they lived, what they ate, what clothes they wore, what work they performed, and it also determined, quite significantly, how they slept. Let us begin at the bottom of this social hierarchy, with the slaves and the poorest laborers. These were people who had no choice about where they slept, what they slept on, or when. A slave might sleep wherever their master permitted. They might sleep in the household where they worked, perhaps in a small room or a corner of a larger space. They might sleep outside, in the courtyard or on the roof. The sleeping surface might be simply the ground, with perhaps a mat thrown down. There might be no covering at all, or perhaps a worn piece of cloth. The challenge for the enslaved person was not merely the heat and the physical discomfort of the sleeping conditions, it was also the lack of control. Sleep is restorative partly because it is a time when the mind can relax, when the constant vigilance required by difficult circumstances can be set aside. But for an enslaved person, true rest might never be possible. Even in sleep, the danger remained. One could be awakened at any time, for any purpose. One's sleeping place could be violated. One's body was not one's own. The work that enslaved people performed also affected their sleep. Some slaves worked in households, doing domestic labor. Their days might be structured, though certainly long and exhausting. They might have some predictability to their schedule, which would allow for some rhythm to their rest. But other slaves worked on large estates or in quarries, performing heavy labor under the sun. These people would have been pushed to the very limits of human endurance, particularly during the hot months. Their sleep, when they got it, would have been a collapse into unconsciousness rather than a peaceful rest. Yet even among the enslaved, there were gradations. A slave who worked in a wealthy household, performing domestic or skilled labor, might have a somewhat better situation than a slave who worked on an agricultural estate or in a quarry. A slave who had earned the trust of their master might be treated with somewhat more consideration than one who was newly acquired or troublesome. Moving up the social hierarchy, we encounter the free poor and the working classes. These were people who were not enslaved, but who nonetheless lived lives of hard labor and limited resources. An agricultural laborer, a day laborer, a stonemason or builder. These people had somewhat more autonomy than slaves. They owned their labor, if not much else. They could, in theory, choose where to work, though. The practical options were limited, and they had some control over how they lived, though that control was constrained by poverty. For these people, a typical sleeping arrangement might be a simple mat in their house, if they owned or rented a house. The house itself would be modest, perhaps a single room or 2 rooms. The walls would be mud brick, as was universal in Egypt for ordinary people. The roof would be flat, as roofs typically were. In the hot months, the laborer might sleep on the roof, as many people did. In the cooler months, they might sleep inside. The family would share sleeping space. Privacy was a luxury that ordinary people did not have. Parents might sleep in one area, children in another, but the space was small and the boundaries were minimal. On hot nights, the entire family might move to the roof. The children would fall asleep to the sound of their parents talking, the rustling of people settling into sleeping positions, the distant sounds of the city or village. A laborer's sleep would typically begin relatively early, by 9 or 10 in the evening, once the heat had decreased enough to make sleep possible. They would rise early, perhaps at 4 or 5 in the morning, to begin their work. During the hottest months, they would take a rest period during the midday hours. This rest period might be a brief sleep, or it might simply be a time of reduced activity in the shade. The total amount of sleep they got might be somewhere around 6 to 8 hours in a 24-hour period, spread between nighttime sleep and the midday rest. The quality of sleep for these working people would have been mixed. The physical fatigue of their labor would have made them sleep deeply when they finally lay down. But the discomfort of the hot sleeping space, the presence of insects, the needs of family members around them, the demands of the early morning start, all of these would have interrupted and fragmented their sleep. And yet, this was their reality. They had adapted to it. Their bodies had adapted to it, and they made the best of it. For the working people, the seasonal variations in sleep patterns would have been marked. During the winter months, October through February, when temperatures were moderate, sleep would have been much more comfortable. They could sleep indoors, they could sleep longer, and the quality of sleep would have been better. During these cooler months, people might sleep 8 or 9 hours at night, and their daytime activities could continue uninterrupted throughout the day. The rhythm of work would be different, faster, more continuous, and the bodies of the workers would have been able to function better on more regular, consolidated sleep. Moving further up the social hierarchy, we come to the middle classes: scribes, skilled craftspeople, merchants, minor officials. These people had substantially better circumstances than the poor. A scribe, for instance, was literate, which meant they had received some education. They worked with documents and administration, rather than with physical labor. They would have earned enough to provide a reasonable standard of living for themselves and their families. A scribe's house might have multiple rooms, a main room for living and working, perhaps separate areas for sleeping, perhaps even a courtyard. The house would still be constructed of mud brick, but it would be well built, with attention to design. The scribe might have 1 or 2 servants to help with household tasks. The sleeping arrangements would be more comfortable than those of the poor. There might be a bed, or at least better bedding. There might be some privacy for sleep, or at least a designated sleeping space. The life of a scribe would typically have been less physically taxing than that of a laborer. A scribe's work was mental rather than physical. They would spend their days in an office or administrative center, recording information, writing documents, performing calculations. The midday heat, while still uncomfortable, would not have been as dangerous as it was for someone performing heavy labor in the sun. A scribe might have taken a brief rest period during the hottest part of the day, but it would not have been the prolonged siesta that a laborer needed. The sleep of a scribe would likely have been somewhat better consolidated than that of a laborer. They might have slept a reasonably full night, perhaps 7 to 8 hours, and perhaps a brief nap or rest period during the day. The quality of sleep would have been better because the sleeping environment was more comfortable and more private. The mind, free from the desperate anxiety about survival that marked the poor, might have been more at ease. For the middle classes, too, seasonal variations in sleep patterns would have been significant, but because their work was less physically demanding and did not expose them to the full heat of the sun, the differences between summer and winter sleep might have been less extreme. In summer, They might have slept somewhat less and experienced more disruption. In winter they would have slept better. But the basic pattern of their lives would have continued year-round. Now we arrive at the elite, the nobility, the wealthy landowners, the high officials and priests. These people lived lives that were qualitatively different from everyone else. They possessed land, property, and resources. They had power, they had authority, and they had comfort. An elite person's house would have been substantially larger and more elaborate than that of an ordinary person. It might have had many rooms, sleeping chambers, reception rooms, storage areas, quarters for servants. It would have been built with careful attention to design, with understanding of how to manage heat and provide comfort. There would have been courtyards, perhaps with gardens or water features. The walls would be well made, the roof sturdy. The decorations might have included painted scenes on the walls, carved wooden elements, fine furnishings. The sleeping chambers of the elite would have been specifically designed spaces. There might be multiple bedrooms, allowing for flexibility in sleeping arrangements depending on the season. The beds would have been well made, perhaps of fine wood, with comfortable surfaces for lying on. There might be pillows filled with soft materials. The coverings would be of fine linen. The sleeping chamber itself would have been positioned to take advantage of cooling breezes while maintaining privacy and security. The elite person would have had servants or slaves to maintain their comfort. These attendants would have opened and closed shutters at the appropriate times. They would have sprinkled water to enhance cooling. They would have used fans to keep air moving. They would have been available to attend to the needs of the sleeper, bringing water, adjusting coverings, providing comfort. The elite person did not have to lie in an uncomfortably hot room and wait for the temperature to drop. Rather, they could rely on their servants to manage the environment. The work of the elite was different from that of ordinary people. While a laborer or scribe might work throughout the day, an elite person's activities were more varied and often less time-consuming. An elite woman might spend her time on household management, religious observance, socializing, and leisure activities. An elite man might spend time on administrative duties, management of his estates, hunting and other leisure activities, and participation in religious ceremonies. The work was less physically demanding, often more interesting, and certainly more respected. The sleep of the elite would have been different. They could have taken full advantage of the cooler nighttime hours. They could have slept longer, more deeply, and more peacefully. They did not have to worry about the demands of early morning labor. They could rise when it suited them. If they chose to rest during the day, they could do so without fear of punishment or loss of income. Their sleep, in short, could be what sleep was meant to be: restorative, peaceful, and uninterrupted. The seasonal variations in sleep for the elite would have been less marked than for ordinary people. Because they did not perform physical labor and did not depend on working in the fields, they were less affected by the heat. In summer they would have slept somewhat less comfortably in the heat, but not to the degree that a laborer would have. In winter they would have slept well as everyone did, but their basic ability to get adequate sleep would have been relatively constant throughout the year. At the very apex of the social hierarchy was the pharaoh. The pharaoh's sleeping arrangements would have been the most elaborate and the most carefully attended to of anyone in Egypt. The pharaoh slept in a palace, in royal chambers that were designed and maintained by the finest architects and artisans. The sleeping space would have been cooled and maintained by numerous servants, whose sole purpose was to ensure the comfort of the divine king. The pharaoh would have had physicians to ensure his health, advisors to manage his state, and priests to attend to his spiritual needs. The pharaoh's sleep would have been uninterrupted, peaceful, and as restorative as sleep could be. Now, let us consider the broader implications of these differences. The quality of sleep a person got directly affected their health, their mental acuity, their ability to work, and their overall well-being. An elite person who slept well could think clearly, make good decisions, and remain healthy into old age. A laborer who slept poorly, whose sleep was fragmented and disturbed by heat and discomfort, would have been more prone to illness, would have had less mental clarity, and would have faced an earlier death. In a sense, the right to good sleep was one of the fundamental privileges of the elite. It was not explicitly articulated as such, but it was embedded in the structure of society. The poor worked hard, in difficult conditions, and slept poorly. The elite lived easily and slept well. This difference in sleep quality would have reinforced the differences in health, capability, and lifespan between the classes. An elite person could expect to live longer, remain mentally sharp, and maintain physical health better than a poor person, and part of the reason for this was that the elite could sleep well, while the poor could not. At the same time, the Egyptians had developed systems and practices that allowed even the poor to achieve adequate sleep, given the constraints of their circumstances. The midday rest period was built into the rhythm of work, allowing people to recover from the heat. The sleeping surfaces, while simple, were designed with understanding of how to maximize comfort and airflow. The seasonal adjustments to work and rest patterns meant that people could work less intensively during the hottest seasons. These were not luxurious accommodations, but they were thoughtful and practical. They allowed people to survive and function, even if they did not allow them to sleep as well as the elite. The contrast between elite and poor sleep arrangements reflects the broader inequalities of Egyptian society, but it also reflects the genuine challenges posed by the climate and the real adaptations that had to be made by everyone. Whether one slept in a palace or a modest house, the heat was the same. The need for rest was the same. The challenge was managing these universal realities within a society that was deeply unequal in its distribution of resources and comfort. For the ordinary Egyptian, sleep was something to be negotiated with, managed, and accepted as part of the rhythm of life. One did one's best to create comfortable conditions for sleep, within the constraints of one's circumstances. One rested during the midday heat when work allowed. One took advantage of the cooler evening and night hours. One accepted the fragmentation and interruption of sleep during the hottest seasons as a natural part of living in Egypt. And when the cooler seasons came, one gratefully took advantage of the ability to sleep better. The elite, by contrast, could afford to pursue sleep as something to be perfected, optimized, and luxuriated in. They had the resources to create ideal sleeping environments. They had the time to sleep as much as they needed. They had the comfort to sleep peacefully. In this sense, the quality of sleep a person experienced was a measure of their position in society, a visible and daily reminder of the privileges and burdens that came with wealth and status. Yet despite these enormous differences, all Egyptians shared something fundamental. They lived in the same climate, under the same sun, in the same heat. And all of them, whether pharaoh or laborer, priest or slave, had to solve the problem of how to sleep in that heat. The solutions looked different depending on one's resources and position, but the basic challenge was universal, and the accumulated wisdom about how to manage it permeated Egyptian culture from top to bottom. Having explored the social dimensions of sleep in ancient Egypt, we now turn our attention to the specific, tangible methods and technologies that the Egyptians developed to make sleep possible in extreme heat. These are not grand innovations in the sense of modern technology. Rather, they are the quiet, accumulated wisdom of generations, simple solutions that worked, refined over centuries through patient observation and adjustment. Let us begin with the most fundamental element of sleep, the sleeping surface itself. We have mentioned beds in passing, but now we must examine them more closely. For the Egyptian bed was not merely a piece of furniture, but a carefully designed tool for managing heat and achieving rest. The typical Egyptian bed, as we know it from archaeological remains and tomb paintings, was a wooden frame elevated on 4 legs. The height of these legs varied, but commonly the sleeping surface was positioned perhaps 12 to 18 inches above the ground. This elevation served multiple purposes. First, it lifted the sleeper away from the ground, where scorpions, snakes, and other creatures might crawl during the night. Second, and more importantly for our purposes, it allowed air to circulate beneath the sleeping body. The principle here is simple but effective. When a person lies on a surface, their body heat is trapped between the body and the surface. If the surface is the ground, or a mat placed directly on the ground, this heat has nowhere to go. It accumulates. The sleeper becomes increasingly uncomfortable. But if the sleeping surface is elevated, with open space beneath it, air can move underneath. The heat can dissipate. The sleeper remains cooler. The sleeping surface itself was not solid wood. Rather, it was typically constructed of woven materials. Cord made from plant fibers, leather straps, or woven rushes were stretched across the wooden frame to create a slightly flexible surface. This weaving had several advantages. The gaps between the strands allowed air to pass through, providing ventilation to both sides of the sleeper's body. The slight give of the woven surface distributed the sleeper's weight more comfortably than a rigid surface would. And the natural materials, plant fibers, leather, did not absorb and retain heat the way that some modern synthetic materials do. The frame of the bed was often angled, with the head end slightly higher than the foot end. This incline, though slight, had benefits. It aided in circulation, preventing blood from pooling in the extremities. It made breathing easier, particularly in the humid conditions near the Nile, and psychologically, it may have provided a sense of being more alert, more ready to respond if needed during the night. The wood used for these beds varied depending on the owner's wealth. For the elite, fine imported woods might be used: cedar from Lebanon, ebony from Nubia. These woods were prized not only for their beauty but for their durability and their pleasant scent. For ordinary people, local woods like acacia or tamarisk were used. These native trees grew in Egypt and provided serviceable, if less elegant, material for furniture. Now, let us consider the headrest, one of the most distinctive and initially puzzling elements of Egyptian sleeping equipment. Modern museum visitors, encountering Egyptian headrests for the first time, often find them uncomfortable looking. They are typically carved from wood or stone, shaped to support the neck rather than the head, and they appear rigid and unyielding. But the Egyptian headrest was designed with specific purposes in mind. In the extreme heat, a soft pillow made of fabric or stuffed with materials would trap heat around the head and neck. The head, being one of the primary radiators of body heat, needs to be able to shed that heat efficiently. A hard headrest, particularly one made of stone, remains cool to the touch even in warm conditions. Placing the neck on such a surface allows heat to conduct away from the body. Moreover, the shape of the headrest, curved to cradle the neck, kept the head elevated and the airway open. This improved breathing and may have reduced snoring, which can be exacerbated by heat and lying flat. The design also kept the sleeper's elaborate hairstyles intact. Many Egyptians, particularly those of means, wore their hair in carefully arranged styles or wore wigs. A soft pillow would have disturbed these arrangements. The headrest allowed the hair or wig to hang freely, undisturbed. Archaeological evidence suggests that some headrests were padded with small pieces of linen or soft materials to provide some cushioning, while still maintaining the cooling properties of the hard surface underneath. This represented a compromise between comfort and function, enough cushioning to make the headrest bearable, but not so much that it trapped heat. The decoration of headrests reveals their importance in Egyptian culture. Many headrests were carved with protective symbols, images of gods, or scenes meant to ward off evil during the vulnerable time of sleep. The god Bez, a protective deity associated with the home and with warding off evil spirits, frequently appears on headrests. His fierce, leonine face was meant to frighten away anything that might threaten the sleeper. Let us now turn to the question of covering. What did Egyptians use to cover themselves during sleep, if anything? The answer varied by season and by social class, but the material was almost universally linen. Linen, woven from flax fibers, was the textile of ancient Egypt. It was produced in vast quantities, used for everything from clothing to mummy wrappings to ship sails. The properties of linen made it ideal for the Egyptian climate. Linen fibers are hollow, which allows them to absorb moisture, perspiration, and release it through evaporation. This wicking action helps keep the skin drier and cooler. Linen is also a smooth fabric that does not irritate the skin, important when one is sleeping in heat and already feeling uncomfortable. And linen becomes softer and more comfortable with repeated washing and use, meaning that even relatively coarse linen cloth would improve over time. For the very hot months, the sleeping covering might be a single, lightweight linen sheet. This sheet, loosely woven to maximize airflow, would be draped over the body. It provided a psychological sense of coverage and protection, while being light enough not to add significant heat. During the cooler months, multiple linen sheets might be layered, or heavier weave linen might be used. The color of linen was typically natural, ranging from cream to light brown, because dyeing was an additional expense and process. White or natural linen had the additional benefit of reflecting rather than absorbing heat. A dark-colored covering would have absorbed radiant heat from the warm walls and roof, making the sleeper uncomfortable. Light-colored linen avoided this problem. For the wealthy, the linen used for sleeping coverings would be of fine quality, with a high thread count that made it smooth and silky. For ordinary people, the linen would be coarser, but still serviceable. Even the poor could generally afford some linen, as it was produced locally and widely available. Now let us consider the role of water in managing sleep comfort. We have mentioned the sprinkling of water in courtyards and on roofs to enhance cooling through evaporation. But water played other roles as well in the Egyptian sleep ritual. Many households, particularly those of some means, maintained ceramic jars or vessels of water in or near sleeping spaces. These vessels, made of porous pottery, would sweat. Moisture would seep through the pottery walls and evaporate, cooling the water inside. A sleeper who woke in the night, uncomfortable from the heat, could drink this cooled water to help lower their core body temperature. The practice of drinking water before sleep and during the night was understood to aid comfort, even if the Egyptians did not know the scientific mechanism by which hydration affects thermoregulation. Some households might also maintain damp cloths that could be placed on the forehead, neck, or wrists to provide cooling. These pulse points, where blood vessels are close to the skin surface, are particularly effective locations for cooling the body. A damp cloth placed on the wrist or neck could help lower core temperature more effectively than cooling the torso directly. Bathing before sleep was another practice that aided comfort. While full submersion bathing was less common than in later Roman culture, Egyptians did wash regularly. The wealthy might have bathing areas in their homes where water could be poured over the body. Ordinary people might wash at a well or at the river. The effect of washing before sleep was significant. It removed the day's accumulation of dust, sweat, and grime, making the skin cleaner and more able to breathe. It provided immediate cooling as the water evaporated from the skin, and it marked a psychological transition from the active, dusty day to the quieter evening. For the elite, scented oils might be applied to the skin after bathing. These oils, made from various plant materials, served multiple purposes. They moisturized the skin, which could become dry in the arid climate. They provided pleasant scents that made the sleeping environment more agreeable, and some oils may have had mild insect repellent properties, helping to keep mosquitoes and other pests at bay during the night. The question of lighting in sleeping spaces is worth considering. In the modern world, we are accustomed to electric lights that can be turned on and off at will. But in ancient Egypt, lighting after dark came from oil lamps, small ceramic vessels filled with oil, with a wick protruding. These lamps provided light, but they also generated heat. In sleeping spaces, therefore, lamps were used sparingly. The typical routine would be to use lamps during the evening hours while people were still active. But as the time for sleep approached, the lamps would be extinguished. Sleeping in complete darkness was normal and expected. The absence of light meant less heat generation and promoted the natural production of sleep-inducing hormones that respond to darkness. The design of sleeping spaces took into account the direction of prevailing winds and breezes. In Egypt, the prevailing wind comes from the north, from the Mediterranean. Houses and sleeping chambers, when possible, were oriented to take advantage of this breeze. Windows or openings on the north side of a structure could be opened to allow cooler air to enter. Corresponding openings on the south side would allow warm air to escape, creating a gentle flow of air through the space. This principle of cross-ventilation, allowing air to flow through a space rather than merely into it, was understood and applied in Egyptian architecture. It required careful positioning of openings and an understanding of how air moves. Hot air rises, so openings high in walls or in the roof allowed warm air to escape. Cooler air, being denser, would enter through lower openings and gradually push the warmer air upward and out. Some households made use of a kind of wind catcher, a structure on the roof designed to capture moving air, and direct it downward into the living spaces. These wind catchers, called malkaf, in later Islamic architecture but with antecedents in ancient Egypt, were essentially vertical shafts with openings at the top that faced the prevailing wind. Air entering the opening would be funneled down the shaft into the house below, providing natural ventilation without the need for any mechanical device. The timing of opening and closing various openings in the house was crucial and required judgment. Open too early in the evening, and hot outside air would flow in. Open too late, and the opportunity to flush out the day's accumulated heat would be missed. The ideal time was typically that narrow window in early evening, when the outside air had cooled below the temperature of the inside air, but before full darkness brought out the insects and other hazards of night. For those who slept on roofs, the sleeping arrangements were somewhat different. The roof sleeper might bring up a simple bed frame or mat to sleep on. Some households had semi-permanent structures on the roof, a kind of pavilion or pergola made of wooden poles with a woven reed roof that provided shade from the moon and stars, while still allowing air circulation. These structures marked out a sleeping space on the roof, while providing some sense of enclosure and privacy. The roof, being exposed to the night sky, benefited from radiative cooling. Heat radiates away from surfaces toward the cold of space. On a clear night, and Egyptian nights were almost always clear, with little cloud cover, the cooling effect of this radiation could be significant. A roof that had baked all day in the sun would cool relatively quickly once the sun set, and the people sleeping on it would benefit from that cooling. However, roof sleeping also came with challenges. Morning dew, while rare in Egypt's dry climate, could occasionally dampen bedding. The early morning sun, rising quickly and intensely, would wake roof sleepers earlier than those sleeping indoors, and there was less protection from any nighttime hazards. These trade-offs were accepted as worth it for the benefit of cooler sleeping conditions during the hottest months. The clothing worn for sleep, as we have mentioned, was minimal. But let us be more specific about what this meant. For men, sleeping attire might be a simple linen loincloth or kilt, or nothing at all. For women, a simple linen shift or tunic, or again, nothing at all for those of lower classes or during the hottest nights. Children typically slept unclothed. This minimalism was not about modesty. Egyptian standards of modesty were different from modern, Western standards, but about comfort. Any clothing worn while sleeping had to be loose, light, and minimal. Tight clothing would restrict circulation and trap heat. Heavy clothing was unbearable. The lightweight linen garments worn for sleep allowed maximum air circulation around the body while providing basic coverage. For the elite, even sleeping garments could be fine and elaborately made, but they remained functional. A wealthy woman might sleep in a pleated linen gown of exceptional quality, but it would still be designed to be cool and comfortable. The pleating, created by a labor-intensive process, actually enhanced cooling by creating more surface area for air to circulate and for sweat to evaporate. The use of fans deserves special mention as one of the most important technologies for managing heat during sleep. We have mentioned them before, but let us now examine them in detail. Fans in ancient Egypt were typically made from palm fronds, papyrus, or other plant materials, mounted on a handle. They could be small enough for an individual to use on themselves, or large enough that they required a servant to wield them. The physics of fanning is straightforward. Moving air across the skin enhances the evaporation of perspiration, which cools the body. Even in very hot conditions, a moving stream of air feels cooler than still air at the same temperature. The sensation of cooling is partly physiological. The evaporation genuinely does lower skin temperature, and partly psychological. The sensation of moving air provides relief and comfort. For the wealthy, servants might be employed specifically to fan during the night. These servants would maintain a rhythm, waving the large fan steadily to keep air moving over the sleeping master or mistress. This was exhausting work for the servant, requiring them to stay awake and active while their employer slept. The servants would typically work in shifts, spelling each other throughout the night. For those without servants, self-fanning before sleep could help. A person could use a small hand fan while lying in bed, waiting to fall asleep. Once sleep came, the fanning would stop, but the initial cooling and comfort helped ease the transition into sleep. Some households used a variant of fanning that required no human effort, hanging cloths or light curtains near openings where breezes entered. These cloths, moving in the breeze, would help distribute the air throughout the space and create a gentle cooling movement of air. The principle was similar to that of a fan, but passive rather than active. Now let us consider the seasonal adjustments to sleeping arrangements in more detail. The Egyptian year, as we have noted, had 3 distinct seasons. The sleeping arrangements shifted with these seasons in ways that were habitual and expected. During Akhet, the inundation season from June to September, when temperatures were highest, sleeping moved to the coolest available locations. This meant roofs for many people, or the coolest interior rooms for others. Bedding was minimal, a light mat and perhaps a single sheet. Clothing was minimal or non-existent. Water was kept close at hand. Windows and doors were strategically opened in the early evening and closed again at dawn. During Peret, the growing season from October to February, temperatures were moderate. Sleeping could move back indoors comfortably. People might use slightly more covering, perhaps multiple linen sheets. Sleeping hours could be longer and more consolidated without the need for midday rest. The windows could remain more fully open without concern about insects, as cooler temperatures reduced insect activity. During Shemu, the harvest season from March to May, temperatures began to climb again. This was a transition period. Early in Shemu, sleeping arrangements remained comfortable, but as the season progressed toward the return of Akhet, the adjustments would begin again, moving toward roofs, reducing coverings, increasing attention to ventilation. This seasonal rhythm was so ingrained in Egyptian culture that it required no conscious thought. People knew, from childhood, when to make which adjustments. The knowledge was passed from parent to child, observed in the practices of the community, reinforced by yearly repetition. The materials used in all these sleeping technologies, wood, linen, clay, leather, plant fibers, were locally available and renewable. The Egyptians were working within their resource base, using what their environment provided. This meant that even though the technologies were simple, they were sustainable. A bed could be repaired or rebuilt using local materials. Linen could be rewoven. Clay vessels could be replaced. The system was robust and self-sustaining. Archaeological evidence of these sleeping technologies comes from multiple sources. Actual beds have been found in tombs, preserved by Egypt's dry climate. Tomb paintings show people sleeping and show the beds and bedding used. Written texts occasionally mention sleeping arrangements or sleeping difficulties. From all these sources, we can reconstruct a detailed picture of how the Egyptians actually slept. One particularly informative source is the tomb of Ka, an architect who lived during the reign of Amenhotep II in the 18th dynasty, around 1400 BCE. Ka's tomb, discovered intact, contained not only his mummy and burial goods, but also everyday objects from his life. Among these were beds, headrests, linen sheets, and other sleeping equipment. The preservation was so good that scholars could examine the construction of these objects in detail: the weave of the linen, the joinery of the bed frame, the carving of the headrests. These artifacts reveal the care and craftsmanship that went into making sleeping equipment. Even for a middle-class person like Kha, the beds were well made, the linen was of good quality, and the headrests were carefully carved. This suggests that sleep was valued enough to invest resources in making it comfortable. Another source of information is the workers' village at Deir el-Medina, home to the craftsmen who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. This village was occupied for several centuries during the New Kingdom, and its remains include houses, workshops, and personal objects. The houses show clear evidence of sleeping arrangements, rooms that appear to have been sleeping chambers, sometimes with built-in sleeping platforms. The documents from Deir el-Medina, written on ostraka, pottery shards, and papyri, include records of daily life, including mentions of sleep and rest. Workers would record when they were unable to work due to illness or other reasons. Sleep difficulties, while not directly mentioned, can be inferred from mentions of illness, fatigue, or the need for rest. These documents provide a glimpse into how ordinary working people managed their sleep and rest within the demands of their labor. The accumulated wisdom about sleeping in Egyptian heat encoded in these technologies and practices, represents the solution of countless individual problems over many centuries. Each element, the elevated bed, the woven surface, the headrest, the linen coverings, the timing of ventilation, the use of water, solved a specific aspect of the challenge. Together, they formed a system that worked, that allowed people to sleep adequately even in temperatures that would be considered unbearable by modern standards. This is the essence of how the ancient Egyptians managed. Sleep in 120-degree heat, not through any single dramatic innovation, but through the patient accumulation and refinement of practical solutions, each small but effective, combined into a coherent approach that worked within the constraints of their technology and their environment. As we move deeper into our exploration of ancient Egyptian sleep practices, we must now turn our attention to a factor that profoundly affects sleep, but is often overlooked: what the Egyptians ate and drank, particularly in the hours before sleep. The connection between diet and sleep quality is something that modern science has documented extensively, but the ancient Egyptians understood this relationship through observation and experience, even without our scientific vocabulary. Let us begin with the evening meal, the final meal of the day that would be taken several hours before sleep. For most Egyptians, this meal was taken in early evening, perhaps around the 6th or 7th hour after sunrise, what we would call roughly 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. The timing was deliberate. Eating too close to sleep could interfere with rest, but eating too early would leave the person hungry during the night. The content of this evening meal varied dramatically by social class, but certain patterns were universal. The staple foods of ancient Egypt were bread and beer, supplemented by whatever other foods were available. Bread was made from emmer wheat or barley, ground into flour and baked. Beer was made from partially baked bread that was then fermented. These two items form the core of most Egyptian meals. For ordinary working people, the evening meal might consist primarily of bread, perhaps some onions or leeks, possibly a small amount of fish, and beer. This might seem like a meager meal by modern standards, but it provided adequate nutrition and, importantly for our purposes, did not overtax the digestive system. The body, when digesting a large, heavy meal, generates internal heat. In the Egyptian climate, adding digestive heat to already high environmental heat would have been uncomfortable and would have interfered with sleep. The bread consumed in Egypt was typically made without leavening, or with only slight leavening. This meant it was denser than modern bread but also easier to digest. The grains used, emmer wheat and barley, are ancient varieties that have different properties from modern wheat. They are somewhat lower in gluten and have a different nutrient profile. The practice of eating bread with every meal meant that Egyptians consumed substantial amounts of complex carbohydrates. Modern sleep science has documented that carbohydrate consumption can influence sleep quality by affecting the availability of tryptophan, an amino acid that is a precursor to serotonin and melatonin, neurotransmitters that regulate sleep. While the Egyptians did not understand this mechanism, they may have observed that eating bread before sleep was associated with better rest. Beer deserves special attention, as it was so central to Egyptian diet and culture. Egyptian beer was different from modern beer. It was thicker, somewhat nutritious, and lower in alcohol content. The fermentation process made it safer to drink than untreated Nile water, which could carry parasites and bacteria. Beer was consumed by everyone, men, women, and children, as a daily beverage. The alcohol content of Egyptian beer, while lower than modern beer, was still sufficient to have mild sedative effects. Alcohol can aid the initial onset of sleep, helping a person relax and fall asleep more quickly. However, it also fragments sleep in the latter part of the night and can interfere with deep, restorative sleep stages. The Egyptians, lacking our understanding of sleep architecture, would not have known these specific effects, but they may have observed that while beer helped them fall asleep, too much beer led to disturbed sleep and morning discomfort. The practice seems to have been moderate consumption of beer with the evening meal, enough to provide hydration, nutrition, and some relaxation, but not enough to cause intoxication or serious sleep disruption. This moderate approach represented practical wisdom developed through experience. For wealthier Egyptians, the evening meal would have included more variety. There might be meat, beef, goat, or mutton, though meat was expensive and would not have been eaten daily even by the wealthy. There would be vegetables, onions, leeks, garlic, lettuce, cucumbers. There might be fruit, dates, figs, grapes. There would be bread and beer, as for everyone. And there might be wine, which was more expensive than beer, and thus more associated with the elite. The variety of foods available to the wealthy created different digestive demands. A meal with substantial meat would take longer to digest and would generate more internal heat during digestion. This created a challenge: how to enjoy the superior foods available while not making sleep uncomfortable. The solution appears to have been timing and moderation. The evening meal, even for the elite, was not necessarily an enormous feast. Large feasts occurred on special occasions, but for daily dining, the meal was moderate in size. This allowed adequate nutrition without overburdening the digestive system. And by eating relatively early in the evening, several hours before sleep, the bulk of digestion could occur before the person attempted to sleep. The types of foods chosen for evening meals also reflect an understanding of digestion and comfort. Heavy, fatty meats were more commonly eaten at midday, when there were many hours of activity afterward to aid digestion. Evening meals tended toward lighter proteins like fish, which digest more quickly and easily. Vegetables, which are generally easy to digest and do not generate as much internal heat during digestion, were favored in evening meals. Certain foods appear to have been specifically associated with promoting rest and sleep. Lettuce was eaten in Egypt, and there is evidence that it was particularly associated with evening meals. The Egyptians may have observed that lettuce had mild sedative or calming properties. Modern analysis has shown that certain varieties of lettuce contain lactucarium, a substance with mild sedative effects. Whether the ancient Egyptian varieties contained this substance, and whether the Egyptians specifically cultivated it for this purpose, remains uncertain. But the association of lettuce with evening meals and rest is documented. Dates, which are rich in natural sugars, were commonly eaten and were particularly valued. A date eaten shortly before sleep could provide a small boost of glucose that might aid in the production of sleep-inducing neurotransmitters. Again, the Egyptians would not have understood the biochemistry, but they may have observed that dates eaten before sleep promoted comfortable rest. Now let us consider the question of water consumption and hydration. In the extreme heat of the Egyptian summer, the human body loses water through perspiration at a remarkable rate. Dehydration interferes with sleep. It can cause headaches, restlessness, and general discomfort. Maintaining adequate hydration was thus essential for sleep quality. The challenge was that the water available from the Nile was not always safe to drink directly. The Nile carried sediment, microorganisms, and sometimes parasites. Drinking untreated Nile water was risky. The Egyptians dealt with this in several ways. Beer, as we have discussed, was fermented and thus safer. But they also had methods of water treatment. Water could be allowed to stand in large vessels, letting sediment settle to the bottom. The clearer water from the top could then be carefully decanted for drinking. Water could also be filtered through sand or fabric to remove some impurities, and in some cases, water might be lightly boiled, though fuel for heating large quantities of water was expensive and not always available. For the elite, servants would prepare drinking water, ensuring it was as clean and safe as possible. This water might be kept in porous pottery vessels that cooled through evaporation. Having clean, cool water available for drinking before sleep and during the night was seen as essential for comfort. The practice seems to have been to drink moderately in the hours before sleep, enough to maintain hydration, but not so much that the need to urinate would interrupt sleep during the night. This balance required judgment and experience. A person who was very hot and had been perspiring heavily might need to drink more to replace lost fluids. A person who had been less active might need less. The consumption of certain herbs and plant materials in evening beverages may have also played a role in promoting sleep. While direct evidence is limited, we know that the Egyptians had sophisticated knowledge of medicinal plants. Various herbs might be steeped in hot water to make infusions, what we would call herbal teas. Some of these herbs may have had calming or mildly sedative properties. Chamomile, for instance, grows in Egypt and has been used for millennia as a calming beverage. Whether the ancient Egyptians specifically used chamomile before sleep is not definitively documented, but it is plausible given their extensive use of plant medicines. Similarly, other calming herbs may have been used in evening beverages to aid relaxation and sleep onset. The medical texts that survive from ancient Egypt include references to remedies for sleeplessness. These remedies typically involved plant materials, sometimes combined with other substances. While the specific preparations are not always clear, ancient medical texts can be cryptic and use terms we do not fully understand. The existence of such remedies tells us that sleep difficulties were recognized as a problem worth addressing and that the Egyptians had developed treatments for. One particularly interesting aspect of Egyptian dietary practice related to sleep involves the consumption of milk. Milk from cows, goats, or sheep was available in ancient Egypt, though it was not as central to the diet as in some other cultures. Milk spoils quickly in hot climates without refrigeration, so it would have been consumed relatively fresh, often shortly after milking. There is some evidence that milk was consumed in the evening or before sleep by some Egyptians. Milk contains tryptophan, the amino acid precursor to sleep-regulating neurotransmitters. It also contains calcium, which plays a role in the production of melatonin. Modern research has documented that milk can have mild sleep-promoting effects, and it is possible that the Egyptians observed similar benefits. However, for many people, particularly those of non-European ancestry, lactose tolerance is limited. Adults who lack sufficient lactase enzyme will experience digestive discomfort when consuming milk. If this were the case for many ancient Egyptians, milk consumption would have been limited or avoided, as digestive discomfort would interfere with sleep. The pattern of milk consumption in ancient Egypt is thus uncertain and may have varied by individual tolerance. The practice of fasting or eating very lightly before sleep appears in some contexts, particularly among priests. Ritual purity requirements for priests included dietary restrictions at certain times. Before performing major rituals or on sacred days, a priest might abstain from certain foods or eat very lightly. This practice may have had the unintended benefit of promoting better sleep, as the body would not be burdened with digesting a large meal. The broader pattern that emerges from examining Egyptian dietary practices related to sleep is one of moderation and timing. Heavy meals were eaten earlier in the day, when there was time for digestion and when the body needed the energy. Evening meals were lighter, easier to digest, and timed to allow several hours between eating and sleep. Beverages were consumed to maintain hydration but not to excess, and certain foods that promoted calmness or sleep were favored in the evening. This approach aligns remarkably well with modern sleep science recommendations. Contemporary sleep experts advise eating lighter meals in the evening, avoiding heavy or spicy foods close to bedtime, limiting alcohol consumption, maintaining hydration, and allowing several hours between the last meal and sleep. The Egyptians, through observation and experience, arrived at similar conclusions. The connection between diet and sleep was understood in the context of the broader Egyptian understanding of health and the body. The Egyptians believed that health resulted from balance of internal humors or forces, balance in the consumption of food and drink, balance in activity and rest. Disease or discomfort resulted from imbalance. This concept of balance meant that dietary choices were seen as having consequences for overall health, including the quality of sleep. A person who ate too much, or ate the wrong things, or ate at the wrong times, would experience discomfort and poor sleep. A person who ate moderately and appropriately would maintain health and sleep well. This understanding, while lacking our modern scientific precision, captured essential truths about the relationship between nutrition and rest. For the poorest Egyptians, dietary choices were severely limited by availability and cost. They ate what they could get, which was primarily bread and beer, with occasional supplements of onions or other inexpensive vegetables. The diet was monotonous but adequate for basic nutrition. And because the food was simple and relatively uniform, digestive problems were likely less common than they might have been with a more varied but unpredictable diet. The seasonal availability of foods also affected diet and sleep. During the growing season, fresh vegetables and fruits were more available. During the harvest season, grain was abundant and bread was plentiful. During the inundation season, when fields were flooded and agriculture was impossible, reliance on stored foods increased. These seasonal variations in diet may have had subtle effects on sleep quality, though these would have been accepted as natural variations in the rhythm of the year. One final aspect of Egyptian dietary practice deserves mention: the social and psychological aspects of evening meals. For many Egyptians, the evening meal was a time of family gathering, conversation, and connection. This social time, while not directly about sleep, contributed to psychological well-being and to the transition from the activity of the day to the rest of the evening. The sharing of food, the conversation with family members, the review of the day's events, and planning for tomorrow. These activities helped a person mentally process their experiences and prepare for rest. In modern terms, we might call this a wind-down routine, a transition period that signals to the body and mind that the active day is ending and rest is approaching. The elite might have had more elaborate evening social activities, larger gatherings, entertainment, music, but even these served a similar function, marking the transition from day to evening, providing enjoyment and relaxation, helping the mind shift from the concerns of work to the readiness for rest. As we consider all these aspects of diet and sleep, what emerges is a picture of a civilization that understood, at a practical level, how what one consumes affects how one sleeps. The specific foods chosen, the timing of meals, the moderation in quantities, the careful selection of beverages, all of these reflected and accumulated wisdom about managing the body's needs in a challenging climate. This wisdom was not written in medical texts as a formal theory. It was embedded in practice, passed down through families, reinforced by cultural norms. It was the kind of knowledge that did not need to be explained because it was simply how things were done, but it was no less sophisticated for being implicit rather than explicit. The modern person, reading about these practices, might be tempted to dismiss them as primitive or unsophisticated. But in fact, the Egyptian approach to the relationship between diet and sleep demonstrates a nuanced understanding that many modern people, with all our scientific knowledge, fail to apply in their own lives. The Egyptians ate light evening meals, consumed moderate amounts of alcohol, maintained hydration, and allowed time for digestion before sleep. These practices, simple as they are, represent effective solutions to the challenge of sleeping well in difficult conditions. We have traveled a long journey together tonight, moving backward through time to understand how the ancient Egyptians managed one of the most fundamental challenges of human existence: how to sleep in extreme heat. As we approach the end of our exploration, let us take a few moments to gather together all the threads we have followed, to see the complete picture that emerges when we combine architecture with innovation, spiritual belief with practical wisdom, social hierarchy with shared human need. The story of sleep in ancient Egypt is, at its heart, a story about adaptation. It is about how human beings, faced with an environment that seems almost hostile to rest, learned to work with that environment rather than against it. The Egyptians could not control the sun. They could not make the temperature drop at will. They could not eliminate the heat that made sleep difficult. But what they could do was observe, experiment, and refine their approach over generations until they had developed a coherent system that made sleep possible. This system was not a single invention, but an accumulation of small insights. The observation that sleeping elevated above the ground was cooler than sleeping directly on it. The discovery that certain materials, linen, woven surfaces, stone headrests, managed heat better than others. The understanding that the timing of opening and closing shutters could make the difference between comfort and misery. The recognition that what one ate and drank in the evening affected the quality of sleep. Each of these insights, modest on its own, contributed to the whole. What makes the Egyptian approach particularly remarkable is its integration. The architectural design of houses, the materials used for bedding, the timing of daily activities, the content of evening meals, the spiritual practices around sleep, all of these were coordinated. They reinforced each other. They formed a system that was greater than the sum of its parts. And because the system was coherent, it was effective. This coherence did not happen by accident. It developed because Egyptian civilization was continuous, stable, and long-lived. The same basic climate, The same basic challenges persisted for thousands of years. This allowed knowledge to accumulate, to be tested repeatedly, to be refined. A practice that worked would be maintained and passed down. A practice that did not work would be abandoned. Over centuries, this process of selection resulted in a highly refined approach to the challenge of sleeping in heat. The social dimensions of sleep that we explored reveal another truth, that the experience of sleep was profoundly shaped by one's position in society. The pharaoh in his palace and the laborer in a modest house both faced the heat, but they faced it with vastly different resources. The pharaoh could command servants to fan him through the night. The laborer could not. The pharaoh could retreat to rooms specifically designed for maximum comfort. The laborer could not. And yet, both the pharaoh and the laborer needed to sleep. Both had to find solutions within their circumstances. This inequality, while stark, did not mean that the poor were without resources or knowledge. The accumulated wisdom about sleeping in heat was widely distributed throughout Egyptian society. Even the poorest person knew to sleep on an elevated surface, if possible, to use linen coverings, to time their sleep to take advantage of the coolest hours, to rest during the dangerous midday heat. The elite had more resources to apply these principles, but the principles themselves were not secrets held only by the wealthy. The spiritual dimension of sleep that we examined reminds us that for the Egyptians, sleep was never merely a physical phenomenon. It was a threshold between worlds, a time when the boundaries between the visible and invisible became permeable. This understanding meant that sleep mattered not just for physical restoration but for spiritual health and connection to the divine. The care taken in preparing for sleep, the protective rituals, the attention to dreams, all of these reflect a civilization that took sleep seriously as a meaningful state of being. This spiritual understanding may have had practical benefits. A person who approaches sleep with intention, who performs calming rituals, who creates a protected and peaceful environment, is more likely to sleep well than a person who simply collapses into bed without preparation. The Egyptian spiritual practices around sleep, while rooted in religious belief, may have inadvertently created conditions that promoted better rest. As we reflect on all that we have learned tonight, certain patterns become clear. The Egyptians understood that sleep required preparation. The body needed to cool down from the day's heat. The mind needed to transition from activity to rest. The sleeping environment needed to be prepared. The right timing for ventilation, the right bedding, the right position. This preparation was not rushed or haphazard. It was deliberate and methodical. The Egyptians understood that sleep required the right environment. A sleeping space needed to be positioned to take advantage of cooling breezes. It needed to be protected from the retained heat of sun-baked walls. It needed to be elevated above the ground. It needed coverings that allowed heat to dissipate rather than trap it. Creating this environment required knowledge and effort, but the effort was worthwhile because it made the difference between restful sleep and miserable wakefulness. The Egyptians understood that sleep required appropriate timing. They worked with the rhythms of heat and coolness rather than against them. They rested during the most dangerous midday heat. They attempted sleep during the cooler evening and nighttime hours. They rose early to take advantage of the relatively cool morning before the heat built again. This timing was not always convenient, but it was necessary. The Egyptians understood that sleep required moderation in food and drink. They ate lighter meals in the evening to avoid the internal heat of digestion. They drank enough to maintain hydration, but not so much as to disrupt sleep with the need to urinate. They consumed foods and beverages that promoted calmness and rest. This dietary wisdom, developed through observation, served them well. All of these understandings about preparation, environment, timing, and diet came together to form an approach to sleep that worked in one of Earth's most challenging climates. And what is perhaps most remarkable is that this approach, developed thousands of years ago without benefit of modern science, aligns closely with what contemporary sleep research tells us about optimal sleep conditions. Modern sleep science emphasizes the importance of a cool sleeping environment. The Egyptians created cool sleeping environments through architecture, timing, and the use of water for evaporative cooling. Modern sleep science emphasizes the importance of appropriate bedding that allows heat dissipation, The Egyptians used elevated beds with woven surfaces and linen coverings that accomplished exactly this. Modern sleep science emphasizes the importance of a wind-down routine that signals to the body that sleep is approaching. The Egyptians had evening rituals, bathing, changing into sleeping garments, preparing the sleeping space, that served this function. Modern sleep science emphasizes the importance of appropriate evening meals that do not overburden the digestive system. The Egyptians ate light evening meals, timed several hours before sleep. Modern sleep science emphasizes the importance of proper hydration, without excessive fluid intake immediately before bed. The Egyptians maintained hydration throughout the day, and drank moderately in the evening. The convergence between ancient Egyptian practice and modern scientific understanding is not coincidental. It reflects the fact that human physiology has not changed fundamentally in the past several thousand years. The same factors that promote good sleep today promoted good sleep then. The Egyptians, through careful observation and accumulated experience, discovered these factors and built a culture around supporting them. There is something deeply satisfying about this convergence. It suggests that wisdom about fundamental human needs can be discovered through observation and experience, even without scientific instruments or formal theories. The Egyptians did not understand the neurochemistry of sleep, the architecture of sleep stages, or the physics of heat transfer in scientific terms. But they understood these things practically, in terms of what worked and what did not, and that practical understanding was sufficient to solve the problem. As we think about the lessons that might be drawn from the Egyptian experience, several possibilities suggest themselves. First, that sleeping well in difficult conditions is possible with the right approach. The challenges the Egyptians faced, extreme heat, limited technology, the need to balance work and rest, were genuine and severe, and yet they managed. They developed solutions that worked. This suggests that with observation, experimentation, and willingness to adapt, difficult problems can be solved. Second, that good sleep requires a systematic approach. It is not enough to address one aspect of the challenge while ignoring others. The Egyptians succeeded because they addressed architecture, bedding, clothing, timing, diet, and spiritual preparation all together. Each element supported the others. This integrated approach was more effective than any single intervention could have been. Third, that cultural knowledge about sleep matters. The Egyptians passed down their understanding of how to sleep in heat from generation to generation. This knowledge was embedded in family practices, community norms, and cultural traditions. It did not need to be rediscovered by each person individually. A child growing up in ancient Egypt would absorb this knowledge naturally, learning from parents and elders how to prepare for sleep, when to rest, what to eat, where to sleep in different seasons. This cultural transmission of sleep knowledge was efficient and effective. Fourth, that the quality of sleep one achieves affects everything else. The Egyptians who slept well were healthier, more mentally acute, more productive, and longer lived than those who slept poorly. This was true across all social classes. Even within the constraints of their social position, individuals who managed their sleep well fared better than those who did not. This suggests that sleep is not a luxury but a necessity, and that investing effort in improving sleep quality yields substantial returns. As we consider these lessons, it is worth asking what modern people might learn from the Egyptian experience. We live in a very different world, with climate control, electric lighting, modern medicine, and abundant resources that the Egyptians could not have imagined. And yet, sleep problems are endemic in modern society. Many people struggle to get adequate, restful sleep. They experience insomnia, fragmented sleep, poor sleep quality. They wake unrefreshed. They rely on caffeine to function during the day and sedatives to sleep at night. Perhaps part of the problem is that modern life has become disconnected from the natural rhythms that the Egyptians lived by. We use artificial light to extend the day far beyond sunset. We eat at irregular times, often consuming heavy meals late in the evening. We keep our homes heated or cooled to constant temperatures year-round, eliminating the natural temperature variations that signal the body when to sleep. We work at times disconnected from natural light and darkness. We fill our sleeping spaces with electronic devices that emit light and noise. We approach sleep as an inconvenience to be minimized rather than a necessity to be honored. The Egyptian approach offers an alternative model. It suggests that working with natural rhythms rather than against them promotes better sleep. It suggests that creating an appropriate sleeping environment matters. It suggests that preparation for sleep, physical, mental, and spiritual, makes a difference. It suggests that community and cultural support for good sleep practices helps everyone sleep better. Of course, we cannot simply recreate ancient Egyptian sleeping practices in the modern world. Our circumstances are too different. But we can draw inspiration from the Egyptian example. We can ask ourselves whether we are creating sleeping environments that promote rest or that interfere with it. We can consider whether our evening routines help us transition to sleep or make sleep more difficult. We can examine whether our diet supports good sleep or undermines it. We can think about whether we approach sleep with intention and respect or treat it as merely dead time. The Egyptians lived 4,000 years ago, in a world very different from ours. And yet they faced a challenge that is fundamentally human: how to get adequate rest in difficult conditions. The solutions they developed, refined over centuries, represent a sophisticated body of knowledge that deserves our attention and respect. They did not have our technology, but they had something equally valuable: patient observation, willingness to experiment, and commitment to passing down what worked. As our journey through ancient Egyptian sleep practices comes to an end, let us take a moment to appreciate what we have learned. We have seen how architecture adapted to climate, how materials were chosen for their properties, how daily schedules aligned with temperature patterns, how diet supported rest, how spiritual practices created meaning around sleep. We have seen how different social classes experienced sleep differently, yet shared a common body of knowledge. We have seen how a civilization developed a coherent system for managing one of life's fundamental challenges. And perhaps, as you lie in your own bed tonight, in your climate-controlled room, with your modern bedding and lighting, you might think for a moment about those ancient sleepers. The laborer on a rooftop under the stars, feeling the desert night air cool against their skin after the brutal heat of the day. The scribe in a modest but well-designed room, settling onto linen coverings after an evening meal and washing. The elite person in a palace chamber, attended by servants with fans, surrounded by every comfort their civilization could provide. The pharaoh in the royal chambers, preparing through ritual for the vulnerable passage into sleep. All of them, separated from us by millennia, and yet connected by the universal human need for rest. All of them facing the same sun, the same heat, the same darkness of night. All of them finding ways, within their circumstances, to achieve the sleep that sustains life. The solutions they developed, simple, practical, effective, worked. They allowed Egyptian civilization to flourish for thousands of years in one of the most challenging climates on Earth. They allowed people to work, to raise families, to create art and architecture, to develop knowledge, to live meaningful lives. And they did all of this while sleeping, without air conditioning, without electric fans, without any of the technologies we take for granted. There is something profound in this achievement. It reminds us that human ingenuity, applied patiently over time, can solve seemingly insurmountable problems. It reminds us that wisdom can emerge from observation and experience. It reminds us that the solutions to our challenges may be simpler and more fundamental than we imagine. It reminds us that sleep, that basic and universal need, is worthy of our attention, our respect, and our care. So, as you settle into your own sleep tonight, perhaps you will carry with you some small piece of ancient Egyptian wisdom. Perhaps you will think about the temperature of your room, the materials of your bedding, the timing of your last meal. Perhaps you will create a small ritual of preparation, marking the transition from day to night. Perhaps you will appreciate the comfort you have, while also understanding that comfort is not only about technology, but also about wisdom in how we prepare for and approach rest. The ancient Egyptians, with all their limitations and challenges, managed to sleep in 120-degree heat. They did it night after night, season after season, generation after generation. They did it not through any single dramatic innovation, but through the patient accumulation of small wisdoms, each contributing to the whole. They understood that sleep was important enough to deserve attention, care, and effort, and they created a culture that supported good sleep for all its members, from the pharaoh to the poorest laborer. This is their legacy to us, the understanding that sleep in difficult conditions is possible, that it requires a systematic approach, that it benefits from cultural support, and that it is worth the effort required to achieve it. May their ancient wisdom help guide you to restful sleep tonight, and may you wake refreshed, as the Egyptians did each morning, ready to face whatever the new day brings. Sleep well. Good night. This has been Boring History for Sleep. Thank you for joining us on this journey back to ancient Egypt to explore the quiet corners of history where ordinary people faced extraordinary challenges and found ways to endure and thrive. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, you can find more explorations of peaceful history at our website. Each episode is designed to be detailed, thorough, and deliberately unstimulating, perfect for those times when you need to slow down, settle in, and drift away. Sleep is one of the most ancient and fundamental of human needs. Every civilization has had to solve the problem of how to achieve it. Tonight, we explored how one particular civilization, in one particular time and place, developed its solutions. But the story of sleep is universal and timeless, connecting us across all the centuries and all the cultures that have come before. May you sleep deeply, may you rest peacefully, and may you wake tomorrow with the quiet satisfaction of having learned something about the long human journey. Until next time, good night.